Thank you for attending this presentation, Achieving the Promise and Avoiding the Pitfalls of Decentralized Trials, which shares the learnings and practical lessons from being involved in decentralized clinical trials during the COVID pandemic and even before then. While working with some terrific sponsor teams and vendors, we were able to keep the overall impact of the pandemic on ongoing studies to relatively minor levels, with none having to stop despite some sites being inaccessible due to COVID restrictions for periods of time. The topics that we will cover include the promise and trends in decentralized trials, also referred to as DCT, as well as the challenges of DCT and solutions that we have successfully used in studies. In order to understand the vantage point of these views, let me first give you a brief introduction to Prevail InfoWorks. Prevail is a systems integrator with their own complete but flexible technology suite for conducting clinical trials. A lot of our intellectual property is focused on placing on a single unified platform, what we refer to as a single interface, all of our eClinical trial systems, including EDC, RTSM, Safety Data Management, eTMF, eDiary, and Site Payment System, as well as all of the sponsors' clinical data from a study or program, and real-time advanced analytics for early readouts from that aggregated data. Prevail will integrate any data source, including many needed for a DCT, including labs, imaging, supplies, ECG, ePro, wearables, the sponsor has in its trials, regardless of data format, including third-party systems that are alternatives to our own, such as EDC, RTSM, and Safety. And we also integrate the data through automated data flows directly from the source system, then QC it at a system level, such as automated data reconciliations and statistical surveillance of the data. Finally, we will tailor the real or near real-time readouts and analysis of that data in any way that best supports the needs of the study, while also giving the user the ability to create their own readouts and analysis. These are just a few of the types of early reporting engines that we are more routinely requested to provide sponsors. There are generally two types of decentralized clinical trials. The first being fully DCT, where there are no sites or few just super sites, no in-person visits after screening, and telemedicine devices are used to collect clinical data and assessments. The second is hybrid DCT, where there are sites and there's a mix of in-person and remote visits. Telemedicine devices and nurse home visits are also used for assessments. The promise of DCT for patients includes reduced travel time, less lost work time, and the comfort of being in the home as opposed to the sterile environment of a hospital or clinic. Some of the interesting facts include that while 80% of patients are willing to participate in trials, less than 5% do, and part of that may be that few live within 2 hours of a clinical site. For the sponsor, the promise of DCT includes reduced cost, faster recruitment, and higher quality data. In terms of cost, our own analysis shows that remote monitoring is about 20% of the cost of on-site monitoring, not including the elimination of travel costs, which can be extensive. By necessity, there was an increase in DCT last year due to the pandemic, which prevented patients and clinical monitors from visiting the investigator sites in ongoing studies and made it difficult to start new studies. The big question is whether DCT will continue to take hold after the pandemic subsides and remote activities are no longer a necessity, but more of an option. David Windley of Jefferies recently opined that DCT will increase above pre-COVID levels to as much as 25 to 30% of studies over the next few years, but will be in the form of hybrid DCT. This is consistent with what we have seen, particularly as sponsors seek to reduce monitoring costs in their studies, which is usually one of the costlier CRO budget items. but still view a fully DCT as too futuristic. We will therefore focus on hybrid DCT. Some of the challenges of DCT relate to site adoption, patient recruitment, data management, supplies management, patient compliance, remote assessments, and remote monitoring. As a starting point, all clinical trials face information and process challenges, including these highlighted by Dr. Janet Woodcock of the FDA a number of years ago, including failure to follow the protocol, data-related issues, including the accuracy, completeness, and consistency of the data, issues related to informed consent, process issues like reporting adverse events, as well as logistical issues like accounting for the disposition of study drug. And the hybrid DCT adds a level of complexity to all of these. More specifically for sites, one challenge is that they are generally slow adopters to new technologies and are resistant to change. Examples of this include their resistance to eSource, where source data is entered directly into a data capture tool instead of first on paper and then later entered into an electronic data capture system. The other issue is cost, since the sites and their coordinators are being asked to do something that their normal budgets do not capture, such as working with monitors remotely or doing remote assessments. To respond to these site challenges, we have found that the processes and tools for implementing remote physician assessments and monitoring need to be flexible enough to match their comfort level and technical capabilities. This has meant that in the same study, different approaches have been needed for different sites. Also, site budgets need to be adjusted to cover DCT. This is an example of a change order from an Australian site after COVID required remote monitoring. And the pricing we have seen has ranged from $75 to $100 per hour being charged by the sites for remote monitoring. Patient recruitment during COVID was obviously problematic since patients could not or would not visit the medical centers and clinics. Even after COVID, returning to normalcy still means half the sites will fail to meet their recruitment targets and 94% enrollment delays. So during COVID, we found patient and site education to be critical. Pre-screening websites, radio ads, flyers were effective in letting patients know that studies were still proceeding and that COVID-related precautions were being taken to safeguard them and their families. Sites were encouraged to start or continue recruitment by educating them on how adjustments would be made to the study to comply with their COVID restrictions and protocols in place. Going forward, we also see the greater comfort people have with online services, such as ordering groceries online, as a possible opportunity for direct-to-patient outreach. In the past, we have successfully deployed IRB-approved pre-screening websites with search engine optimization that patients can find through a web search. More recently, we have teamed up with a big data company to leverage their big data with AI to identify in real time people whose internet activity and physical location might suggest interest in a clinical trial, engaging them through web placements about the study or through an email associated with their IP address, directing them to a pre-screening website, and if appropriate, directing them to the closest clinical site. DCT also creates data management challenges due to the increased volume and sources of data, including patient-reported data through handheld devices and wearables that are collecting biometric data. This eye chart of a diagram is an example of a phase 2 study that was partially decentralized during COVID. And as you can see, there were quite a few sources generating data, including 2 sources of data being directly and remotely generated by the patients, to an e-diary and a wearable actigraphy device collecting sleep data. Critical to making timely and effective use of the data was our central data repository, which integrated all of the data in real or near real time, reconciled it, and then distributed the data and resulting analysis to the various stakeholders based on their roles. Managing the drug or kit supply in DCT, where the kits are delivered to a patient's home instead of a site, can add complexity to an already challenging part of trials. Beyond the problems that arise whenever you introduce a new process, there are drug accountability issues and other unique issues like dealing with drug temperature controls at a patient's home when a kitchen freezer is inadequate. As a starting point, we find that studies need a randomization and trial supply management system that is flexible enough to modify familiar processes while remaining HIPAA compliant, since someone will need to know the patient's name and address to make a delivery there. Our experience with our own RTSM has been to electronically instruct the depots to redirect the shipments from the sites to the patient's homes and placing any personalized information solely in the hands of the depot, which is firewalled from any clinical data. Also, we have automated the reordering process based on completion of electronic case report forms, in some instances, the ePro system, and addressed the accountability issues by real-time tracking of kit status from order to dispense or destruction. In the case of self-dispensed drugs, have taken special measures such as calculating the amount of drug used based on the return weight of a drug container. DCT also presents greater risk of patient noncompliance, whether in data entry by the patient or proper use of a wearable device. This is an example of a risk resulting from patients self-administering a topical drug at home without supervision. In analyzing historical data from a prior study, and specifically the intersection between the size of a patient's lesion that needed to be treated and the amount of drug that the patient put on the lesion, we found that some patients were applying very little drug on large lesions, represented by the red circle, and others were applying a lot of drug on small lesions, represented by the rectangle. And we further extrapolated that those patients did not do as well as patients that were closer to the mean. The solution in that study included more clearly defining in the protocol the amount of drug that should be used based on lesion size, training the patient and the investigators, and putting in place good compliance monitoring tools and processes. Prior to COVID, there was a general reluctance on the part of major medical centers to use telemedicine. I have it on good authority from one of the top centers in the country that a big reason for that was liability issues. Well, COVID caused them to drop that concern, and telemedicine is likely here to stay, although at what level is yet to be determined. However, in the context of trials, telemedicine has at least the limitations listed here, including the inability to do a blood draw online, the preference by some patients to have in-person visits over video conferencing, also things like patchwork of federal and state regulations, and technology availability. Not everyone has broadband for video conferencing. An effective alternative to telemedicine and site visits is home nurse visits or nurse home visits, where the nurses visit the patient in their homes and can do the physical assessments, take their vitals, do the blood draws, urinalysis, administer the ECG, and do assessments of changes in signs and symptoms and ConMeds. There is one caveat though. It can be expensive, as we have seen cost of between $4,000 to $7,000 per visit, with a higher number being in studies with fewer required visits. It's quite possible this pricing will go down with greater competition, and when this becomes a post-COVID option and not a necessity. Last but not least are the monitoring-related challenges in DCT. eSource can eliminate some of these challenges, but again, it has not been adopted very quickly. In fact, it's been slowly adopted by the sites. For remote source data verification, monitors obviously need access to the source documents. Sites are simply not set up for remote monitoring and have different levels of comfort with it. And there is also the potential for fraud. We have found the best approach is, again, being flexible. Some sites prefer over-the-shoulder video conferencing between the site coordinator and monitor, in which the source documents are reviewed on camera. We've also successfully used our remote monitoring module, which has two main approaches: supporting secure temporal document uploads, as well as non-SDV or source data verification review of eCRFs based on risk level. Under the secure temporal approach, only the monitored site coordinator have access to the system. Specific documents associated with a subject visit are encrypted and securely uploaded into the system by the site. And the documents are permanently deleted from the system after a preset time before which the monitor can review them. This allows the site coordinators to upload the documents within their own time windows without needing the monitor to be present. The monitors can then review and compare the source documents in the eCRFs, or electronic case report forms, in separate viewing windows, and even issue queries through the system. This also has the benefit of allowing the monitors to work within their own time windows and not be dependent on the availability of the site coordinator. The module also tracks and reports the completeness of the source documents available for verification, as you can see here with the red highlighting a missing source document. The other approach sponsors have found helpful, and which we have used even before COVID, is providing the monitors a workflow tool for reviewing eCRFs for reasons other than source data verification purposes. It lists the eCRFs available for remote monitoring, as you can see here. It also provides a direct link to the eCRFs and tracks the monitor's review of the eCRFs. This supports remote monitoring in at least two ways. First, it avoids SDV when risk supported. And secondly, even if an eCRF needs to be source data verified, it allows the monitor to review the data for completeness, clinical consistency, and protocol compliance remotely, and thereby limit the work and time needed to be on site by the monitor. In summary, future use of DCT will likely be more of a hybrid model, creating new challenges for sponsors, sites, and vendors, also requiring technology that is flexible enough to fully support the strategy, and very importantly, an openness from all stakeholders to new ways of conducting studies. Thank you again for your attention, and with that, I would be happy to answer any questions.
Hi, Patrick. So I can see you, I can hear you, all good sign?
Perfect.
Yeah, so firstly, thank you so much for your talk. It's really, really interesting. We've got a few questions that have come in from our audience here. The first one is, in your opinion, what aspects of virtual trials are more likely to stay?
Sure, that's a good question, Zoe. So I think because of the potential cost savings, remote monitoring is likely here to stay, at least at some level. It probably won't be 100% remote monitoring very often, but we do see that most sponsors want some portion of the monitoring to be remote. Again, mostly because of the cost savings. On the other hand, remote physician assessments also have, I think, staying power, but probably at a lesser extent. For the cost savings as well, call-in visits in between in-person visits is likely to continue, and then also probably wearables and patient-reported outcomes. I mean, it's nothing new, so it's also likely to stay. But I think there will be kind of a corresponding increased attention given to ways to ensure that there's patient compliance as well as high quality data coming from those sources of information.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And slightly related to that as well, are there certain indications that are more conductive to decentralized clinical trials?
There are, studies that involve patients with fewer comorbidities, or the endpoints are kind of patient-reported. They're typically going to be better for decentralized studies. Looking at the other way, with oncology studies, it's not ideally suited for decentralized studies since in-person visits are better suited for assessing very sick patients, which obviously you have a lot of that in oncology studies. As well as doing things like blood draws, as well as administering IV treatments would be some of the reasons why oncology on the one spectrum it's not as well suited, but again where studies involve patients with fewer comorbidities and particularly where the endpoints are patient reported, certainly they're very well suited for DCT.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Another question here. In slide 23, you mentioned this was a view where your solutions and services improved this and that. It was quite a loud slide. It was quite a loud slide. I was interested in knowing how much more complex the flow and the process was, if you wouldn't mind elaborating a bit more there.
Sure. Definitely a loud slide, kind of an eye chart, but it was a complex study, but certainly not the most complex study we've worked on. But our role really is to make the complex simple for the user. And that particular phase 2 shown in the slide that was referenced, which I guess was slide 23. Part of the complexity was certainly integrating those 9 or so vendors, but equally important was making sure that there was that it was seamless to the dozen or so functional roles that needed to really use some portion of that aggregated data on a day-to-day basis, and that really runs the gamut from project managers, site monitors, medical reviewers, data managers, supply chain managers. In that particular one, there were project accountants, also biostats, which is all kind of on the right side, of that central database. The left side being the vendors were pulling that data from. So. But yes, it was complex, but certainly not the most complex that it was involved in.
Yeah, I'm sure. And we have another comment here. I am from a small biotech, and our team is skeptical about decentralized trials and RBM. Is that something you come across a lot from small biotechs?
It's understandable. Any time a team may be dealing with something that's new to the organization, but with respect to decentralized trials, in one form or another, and hopefully I touched on some of the different forms. It does have a proven track record, for saving costs and really improving patient experience. And really, in many respects, it's particularly well suited for small biotech because they can benefit in many ways from the cost savings, more so than anyone, without compromising quality, because those companies are pre-revenue, and obviously cost is always an important factor. But really, I think at least from my perspective, a kind of an incremental adoption is probably the best approach for any company that's going to try it anew. So, but no, it's certainly understandable, as I said before, but really does have a long or relatively long track record in some respects. And again, I think very well suited for small biotech companies.
Yeah, I suppose sometimes it's always hard to get management's initial input.
Yeah.
Just got a few more questions here. Shipments triggered by ECRF completion. Any issues observed? Any delay to supply the drug? As we know, the sites don't really comply with ECRF completion guidance and timelines.
Not really. However, that really is a legitimate factor that needs to be addressed, upfront with the sites, during training, and also, follow up through, out the study, based on really closely monitoring their performance and having good reporting tools. And in particular, our supply management algorithm will normally take some amount of delay into account in terms of determining the appropriate inventory levels to be maintained, with the patient or more traditionally with the sites. We have automated the supplies management, very large global studies, over 200 sites, in which there's going to be variability in terms of the latency of those sites entering data in the ATC system. In those very large studies with over 200 sites, we've had instances where there were no manual orders needed to be placed for over a period of years. So it can definitely be done, but certainly it is a factor that needs to be put into the equation.
Yes, thank you. I think we might just have time for one more question. We've just had one come in.
Sure.
What makes your solution unique compared to other decentralized trial solutions? Ooh, a good question there.
No, it's a fair question. It's really, I think of it really kind of three primary things. The first really is the ability to integrate data sources easily and also very importantly agnostically, without imposing the time and cost burden of requiring all the data be converted to CDISC or SDTM or SAS data sets before it being available, real or near real time analysis to the stakeholders. So that would be the first thing. I guess the second thing is the level at which we combine reporting tools with workflow tools, so that information is not just being observed, but it's also really helping drive the actions and processes in the study. So, for example, our system generates automated visual patient profiles. It's part of a workflow tool that tracks the clinical review of patients, so that medical reviewers know who's been reviewed, and really more importantly, who and what needs to be reviewed at a given point in time. So that's the second thing. Really, is just not having reporting tools for reporting's sake, but really integrating into a workflow process. And then just lastly, I think it's our flexibility to really address any specific needs a study or study team may need. If it can be defined, that's kind of our mantra. If it can be defined, we can do it, and we'll do it. In terms of kind of configuring the tools to address those specific needs. So I would say they're probably the three primary things.
Brilliant, thank you.
No, thank you.
I think we are just coming up to the end of our time here, so we might just have to wrap up the Q&A now. So I just want to say massive thank you to Patrick for your time joining us here today. Really appreciate it.
It was my pleasure.
And just what's the best way for people to get in touch with you if they do have any further questions?
They can certainly email me at patrick.keenan, that's KEENAN, at prevailinfoworks.com.
Perfect, brilliant. Yeah, well, thank you so much. We look forward to seeing you again at the next one.
Thank you, sir.
Thank
Much
you. Bye-bye.
appreciated. Bye-bye.